How does the Falcons roster and depth chart look now that the draft is over? We'll break it down on today's Locked On Falcons.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, y'all know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, aka Mr. Drew, aka Sirius Black, and of course, the very humble host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And we thank everyone that makes this illustrious podcast their first listen each and every day. Of course, you should subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts to get the latest episode as soon as it is available. And on YouTube, it's available the night before the audio drops. So, guys, today we will be just sort of catching up on the news, right? I'm in the process of, beginning my in-depth film study of Bijan Robinson. We have some guests that will be coming on the podcast over the next couple of days and or week to talk about the Falcons draft class and some of these prospects. So, today is, I'll be upfront with you. It's kind of, okay, let's just get rid of the odds and ends before we get into this headlong sprint of post-draft related content. And, later in today's episode, we'll talk a little bit about some of the workouts that the Falcons are doing, what they're going to do at the wide receiver position. We'll talk about the fifth-year option for AJ Terrell, as well as the undrafted free agent signings. But we'll start off today's episode looking at the Falcons post-draft depth chart. And somebody on Twitter asked me, Aaron, are we going to get a updated depth chart? And I'm blanking on that person's name. I apologize. And I needed to get the upgraded graphics, and I got the upgraded graphics, guys. So let's go through the depth chart. And if you missed the earlier one we did like the week before the draft, it's basically just an updated version of that. Here is the offense, and the key for deciphering this is it's color coded. A blue is a cornerstone player, light blue is a quality starter, green is a rookie, yellow is an adequate starter, orange is a replacement level starter, purple is quality depth, red is a not roster caliber player, pink is an incomplete evaluation, typically young players that we just haven't seen enough of to really fit them in any of these other categories, and gray is a practice squad or developmental guy. And rather than going through, all the different color coding, again, if you're listening to the audio version of the podcast, is another excuse for you to go to the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel, subscribe so that you can see the various color coding on these players and prospects. But for today, I'm just going to basically break down all the 53 players that I have projected to make the roster. And if you're looking at your screen, it's all the players that I have capitalized. Their names are the players that I, sitting here today, would project to make the Falcons 53-man roster. And pretty consistently over the last decade, I've been able to get within 90% accuracy, even as early as, May 1st in some of these years. So I'm hoping that will be wind up truing. So basically get like at least 48 of the 53 correct projections with some leeway for injuries and whatnot. But the quarterbacks I have making are Desmond Ridder and Taylor Heineke. The running backs, I have the Falcons keeping 5 of them: Bijan Robinson, Tyler Algier, Cordarrelle Patterson, Avery Williams, and Keith Smith. I do expect Caleb Huntley. I do not have Caleb Huntley making the roster, but that is mostly because I'm expecting him to go on the PUP list, the physically unable to perform list, coming out Achilles injury. So that will be something we'll keep an eye on if and when he returns to practice, either prior to training camp, then that will make him probably ineligible for the PUP list. But if he is still recovering from that Achilles injury, leading into training camp, they can put him on the PUP list at the beginning of camp, and that will make him eligible to go on the PUP list during the regular season, thus saving the Falcons a roster spot and not having them to have to shut down Caleb Huntley for the entire year. So we'll see how that goes. But wide receiver, I have them keeping 5 receivers in Drake London, Mac Hollins, Scotty Miller, Cordarrelle Hodge, and Jared Bernhardt. Tight end, I have 4 tight ends: Kyle Pitts, Jonnu Smith, Parker Hesse, and John Fitzpatrick. Offensive linemen, 9 offensive linemen, and Jake Matthews, Matthew Bergeron, Drew Dahlman, Chris Lindstrom, Caleb McGarry, Joshua Miles, Jalen Mayfield, Matt Hennessy, and Ethan Greenwich. So probably the most high profile player that I have not making the Falcons roster that you guys can see is probably Jermaine Ifedi. So switching over to the defensive side of the ball, on the defensive line, I have the Falcons with Calais Campbell, David Onyemata, Grady Jarrett, Taquan Graham, Eddie Goldman, and Zach Harrison. As far as edge rushers go, I have them keeping 4 in Arnold Ebiketie, Bud Dupree, Lorenzo Carter, and D'Angelo Malone. The linebacker position, I have them keeping 5 in Caden Ellis, Michael Walker, Troy Anderson, Tay Davis, and Nate Landman. Cornerback, I have them keeping 6 with Jeff Okudah, AJ Terrell, Darren Hall, Mike Hughes, Clark Phillips, and D. Alford. And at safety, I have them keeping 4 safeties in Jesse Bates, DeMarco Helms, Richie Grant, Jalen Hawkins, and of course, 3 special teamers that do not appear on these depth charts with Younghoe Koo, Bradley Pinion, and Liam McCullough. And of course, the other big news of the day, for those of you that are very invested in that, speaking of Younghoe Koo, is that Bijan Robinson will be rocking number 7 for the Atlanta Falcons moving forward. And so we'll find out what Younghoe Koo will switch his number to in the future. But that is sort of the big news of the day. But, obviously I can't build I'm sure some people can build an entire podcast around talking about the depth chart. But if you look at these depth charts, right, for me, at least based off of my evaluation of these players, to me, the biggest areas of concern on your depth chart are the players where you have an underwhelming starter. So basically a replacement level or lower starter. You have a gray player, a developmental player as your top backup. And, for some of these areas where the Falcons have a pink player, incomplete evaluation player, that's fine to have as your starter or your top backup because, these are all young players with upside, right? We don't quite know what category to put, like Darren Hall. Is Darren Hall a gray or is he a purple? I don't know. Is Jeff Okudah a quality starter, an adequate starter, a replacement level starter, or a quality backup? We don't quite know. And so that's why some of these players are pink. But when you look at this roster, starting with the defense, the biggest areas of concern for me right now on the defensive side of the ball is that backup Mike linebacker where Tay Davis and Nate Landman, both gray players, are your top backup for Troy Anderson. So that would be one area of this roster that if the Falcons were to pick up a linebacker in free agency, that would make a ton of sense to me going into training camp. Again, this is around the time when they picked up Nick Kwiatkowski a year ago. That type of move makes a ton of sense. A guy that's a quality backup, can play special teams, but we'll see if the Falcons go in that direction. Switching back to the offensive side of the ball, the 2 areas of concern to me are the wide receiver 2, that Z wide receiver, where I have Matt Collins and Scotty Miller atop the depth chart. Both of them are replacement level starters in my eyes, and you feel like you want to get a little bit better than a replacement level starter. Although, as we've discussed many times, I don't know if the Falcons are going to feel as compelled because of the style of offense that they're going to run, focusing on the run game and whatnot. And the swing tackle position, right? Without Jermaine Ifedi, or Jermaine Ifedi's not truly a swing tackle because he's going to play right on the right side. And so right now your top option at the swing tackle, in my humble opinion, is Joshua Miles. Part of the reason I think that is Joshua Miles got more guaranteed money than Jermaine Ifedi did, right, this offseason from the Atlanta Falcons. And so either Miles or Ethan Greenwich are your top candidates to be that swing tackle based off of that. And that, to me, is an area of concern. Now, we know that the Falcons are looking at more wide receiver help and offensive tackle help. We'll see if they look further at linebacker help as the summer unfolds, but they did bring in some wide receivers to work out for the team on Tuesday. We'll also talk a little bit about some trade candidates that may be a possibility between now and the start of the season, as well as if Cordarrelle Patterson can help pick up some of the slack at the wide receiver position by making a little bit more hay at that spot as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. But first, guys, I want to tell you that you should make a fast break to FanDuel during the NBA playoffs, because right now new customers get a no sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's $1,000 back in bonus bets, even if your first bet doesn't win. And, you can bet on the NBA playoffs. And now that the draft is over, you can also bet on NFL season props, right? The Falcons are 60-1 odds to win the Super Bowl this year. Or you can feel better about them winning the NFC South, where they're 3-1 odds, right? The Bijan Robinson is the favorite for offensive rookie of the year, so you can put some money on that. As well as you can bet Major League Baseball, and they have a great parlay builder over at FanDuel where you can pick different players that you think are going to get a hit or a run or home run, combine them into one bet so that you can bet a little to win a lot in a parlay. So there is absolutely no better place for all this betting action than America's number one sports book in FanDuel. All you got to do is visit fanduel.com/locked on, and you'll get your no sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's fanduel.com/locked on. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. So, guys, I want to give a shout out to all my everydayers that make this illustrious podcast their first listen. Tomorrow, I think we'll be joined by Will McFadden of the Believe in Falcons podcast, formerly of AtlantaFalcons.com and Falcoholic and all that stuff and more. We have a lot of guests on the docket coming over the next several days, and we'll see sort of how that gets all scheduled out, but various people to talk about the Falcons draft and the individual players as well. So that is the plan, and we'll eventually get to the scouting reports on all 6 of the Falcons draft picks. I don't think I'm going to get to Bijan this week, but probably next week. And my hope is at the very least we'll be able to get like one done each and every week so that we should be able to get it all done, wrapped up by the time we get to the middle of June. But we'll see how that goes. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen, of course, and do so every single day. But let's talk about the Falcons looking for more wide receiver help. And, again, this is going to be the running theme and the running gag here on the podcast. Is this the week that the Falcons trade for Corey Davis? No, probably not, right? But the Falcons did work out a couple of receivers on Tuesday. Slade Bolden, the former Alabama slot receiver, who was an undrafted free agent in 2022. Penny Hart, the former Georgia State wide receiver that was an undrafted free agent way back in 2019. He spent the last couple of years playing special teams as a gunner for the Seattle Seahawks. And what's interesting about Penny Hart is he was a player I thought the Falcons were going to draft back in 2019, but then he had a really terrible pro day. And then he basically went undrafted, and the Falcons wind up drafting Marcus Green that year in the 6th round. You guys remember Marcus Green from which Louisiana? Was it Louisiana Monroe or Louisiana Lafayette? I think it was Louisiana Monroe. And he didn't last. But, Penny Hart's still going strong in the league, so feels like the Falcons should have just taken Penny Hart, pro day, be damned. But we'll see if the Falcons, wind up signing any of these receivers. We'll see if the Falcons also, mind the XFL. They're bringing in a tackle in Barry Wesley for their rookie minicamp. He played most recently with Seattle in the XFL. And according to PFF, he was the highest graded left tackle in that league this past year, going back to what I said earlier about the Falcons, still looking at options for that swing tackle just to get more bodies in the room, just because, you don't want to, that's an important position. That is underrated. It's like backup quarterback and swing tackle, probably like, the 2 most important depth players on your offense you can make an argument for. So, that's going to be something to keep an eye on. But I do wonder if the Falcons are potentially going to make a bigger move rather than just bring in these quote unquote bodies. No offense to Slade Bolden, Penny Hart, and Barry Wesley, but, get an established player at the wide receiver position at some point between now and the start of the regular season. I don't think the Falcons are going to be in any rush to do so, but it goes back to a conversation I think we had in March where I talked about the possibility of, we were talking about, the possibility of trading for DeAndre Hopkins. And we talked about some other wide receivers that the Falcons could trade for that would not necessarily be as expensive as DeAndre Hopkins. And some of those players were Corey Davis with the Jets, Tyler Boyd with the Bengals, Hunter Renfrow with the Raiders, Van Jefferson with the Rams. And what's interesting is the Falcons currently have $14 million in cap space, according to overthecap.com. And it's about $9 million in effective cap space, according to that website, which is basically how much they would have after they sign all the rookies, which would be about $5 million in cap that the Falcons would need to do in order to get all those guys signed. And because of that, they really can't trade for Corey Davis, because right now, if you were to trade for Corey Davis, you would have to have $10.5 million in cap space to absorb that contract. So if the Falcons were to trade for Corey Davis and sign their rookies, they would have to make some moves in order to clear cap space or restructure some contracts, which they could do. So it's not out of the realm of possibilities, but we would have to see the Falcons, make some adjustments before being able to fit Corey Davis under the cap. They could fit Tyler Boyd, as they would only have to inherit about an $8.5 million base salary in order to make that trade for Tyler Boyd. Hunter Renfrow of these guys is probably the most palatable because his base salary is about 6.5, and that would be what the Falcons would inherit. So they have enough cap space to cover that. And Van Jefferson, of course, still in a rookie contract. Doesn't seem like the Rams are going to trade him. I thought the Rams might draft a receiver this year, but they did not. It's notable that the Jets did bring in multiple receivers this offseason, and Mecole Hardman and Alan Lazard. So Corey Davis is kind of like the number 3/4 receiver. So they're paying quite a bit for a guy that's not one of your top two options. The Bengals also drafted two receivers, Charlie Jones in the fourth, Andre Yeshovis, I don't know how to say his name, Iashovis, I don't know, in the sixth round. But basically, it's very clear that the Bengals are positioning themselves to probably move on from Tyler Boyd, because I think this year is the last year of his contract. So he'll probably walk into free agency. So he's a player that they could shop at a certain point between now and the trade deadline on Halloween, I believe. And then Van Jefferson is a player that it'll be interesting to see what the Rams do with him, simply because he's in a contract year, and are they going to pay him? Right. And so, they're kind of tearing things down, but right now he's their number 2 receiver. So I don't think they would give him away like it seemed like they were poised to do earlier this offseason. Of course, Hunter Renfrow, the Raiders just took Trey Tucker out of Cincinnati in round 3. And so, Trey Tucker's a slot receiver. It's like they've been, there's been rumors that they've been shopping Hunter Renfrow for like 6 months. So it's like eventually someone's going to trade for Hunter Renfrow. We know it's probably going to be Patriots, but at some point. So these are some options for the Falcons if they want to make a trade for an outside candidate. But they do have some in-house candidates, and that is none other than Cordarrelle Patterson and Avery Williams. And we've seen Patterson line up at wide receiver. About 20% of his snaps last year came either as a slot receiver or out wide at wide receiver. That was 34% in 2021. Avery Williams as well, doesn't get a ton of playing time, but does spend a decent chunk being split out wide. About 35% of his snaps last season during the regular season were at slot or out wide. And what's notable is about 54% of his preseason snaps were at slot receiver or out wide. And that was something I noticed, breaking down the depth charts in the preseason games, where it's like it seemed like a lot more snaps that Avery Williams was getting at wide receiver. So those are two players that internally the Falcons could decide, in order to supplement their current group of receivers, let's get those guys more snaps at receivers. And especially if you have a Tyler Algier, if you have a Bijan Robinson ready to go at the running back position, you can feel pretty good about that group of receivers, just, those two players supplementing your receivers. Again, you're not expecting Patterson to go out there and play, 50 snaps at wide receiver. The same thing with Avery Williams, but it does help out your roster. And so, I've seen some people speculating that, Cordarrelle Patterson might be on the roster bubble. I don't think that's the case. It is possible that the Falcons could cut Cordarrelle Patterson at the end of training camp and save about $4.25 million against the salary cap. But given that the Falcons want to play positionless football, I think Patterson is just too valuable in that arena, right? And we talk about this all the time on the podcast, right? Depth is not about having starter quality backups, right? And there's a couple of places, as you guys saw in the depth chart, where I do think the Falcons do have starter quality backups, like a Bud Dupree, etc. But that's not really what having good depth is about. Depth is about, hey, if your starter goes down and misses a game or two, that the backup steps up and you don't have to change your identity or the way that you play. And that, to me, is the key with Cordarrelle Patterson. Like, in a world where, let's say, Bijan Robinson tweaks his ankle and misses a couple of games, you still want to be able to do all the things that you were doing with Bijan Robinson that we discussed on yesterday's episode, with all the formational flexibility. Patterson's the OG of that. And so that value, plus the return value, plus that versatility to play wide receiver, plus the fact that he's the Falcons' most effective red zone and short yardage runner, until Bijan and Algier can prove themselves, all of that to me makes it so that Cordarrelle Patterson is well worth the money that the Falcons are paying for him, even if he's not going to necessarily be as big a part of the offense this year as he has been in previous years. But frankly, at this point in this stage in Patterson's career, that should be the case, right? We don't want Cordarrelle Patterson to have to rely on a 32-year-old running back to basically carry 30% of the offense or whatever the number is for him. So that, to me, the idea that Cordarrelle Patterson might be cut, same thing with Avery Williams, is a non-starter for me. If anybody's going to get cut, it's going to be Caleb Huntley. But again, going back to what I said earlier, the injury, kind of insulates him, I guess, to a certain extent, because he's covering off of that Achilles injury. But if I was to go back to the depth chart, to me, the highest profile player right now on the Falcons roster that's on the bubble, as I said earlier, is Jermaine Ifedi. Right. And now you can certainly look at a couple of 2021 and 2022 draft picks like a Jalen Mayfield, Justin Schaefer, Darren Hall, Ade Ogundeji, Frank Darby, etc. That, may not necessarily, I wouldn't sit here and tell you that all of those guys are going to make the roster. And as you saw earlier, I didn't predict all of those guys to make the roster. But in terms of like, I don't know if those guys are high profile. No shade meant at those guys, but you get what I'm saying. So like, to me, I don't think anybody you think is going to make the roster is probably going to make the roster. I think it's really the Falcons. The competition is going to be for the back end roster spots, not the high end, depth chart spots. So we'll see how that goes, but we'll wrap up today's episode talking a little bit about AJ Terrell getting his 5th-year option and Jeff Okudah not getting his 5th-year option, as well as the 6 undrafted free agents and who are the guys that are most likely to potentially get a crack at the practice squad as we continue and wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So, guys, continuing today's illustrious podcast, and again, want to give a shout out to all my everydayers who stay strong and continue to listen to this podcast well after the 20-minute mark. You guys are the true fans. But let's talk about the Falcons' 6 undrafted free agent signings, and I believe this puts their roster at 89 players, so they still have technically 1 roster spot, and that's counting the 6 rookies. So technically they have like 7 roster spots available because I think they have technically 84 players under contract. But once they sign those 6 rookies, then it will 83 players. I'm sorry, I can't do math. So yeah, we'll see how that goes. But anyway, the 6 undrafted free agents, probably the highest profile player is Akina Chukwu, the Rice defensive end, 6'4", 264-pound defensive end, probably the highest rated guy. He was of this group. He was the player that I was most familiar with, seeing him at various rankings. I think Dane Brugler had him as edge 45 in his Beast draft guide. So probably the only player that he was listed as a priority free agent, if I'm not mistaken. But, everybody else was lower on their list. Probably the next man up in terms of the most interesting player is Keelan Harris, the Oklahoma Baptist receiver. He was wide receiver 68, according to Dane Brugler. But Harris stands out to me just because Matt Waldman mentioned him when we had him as a guest on the podcast, like the week before the draft, where I had him and Savion Mixon come on the podcast and talk about wide receiver targets. I think Matt mentioned Keelan Harris just sort of offhand, the Oklahoma Baptist receiver, at the end of that conversation. And it's notable because Matt Waldman, I think, also talked up Olamide Zaccheaus like 4 or 5 years ago. How long was that? 2018? Was that Zaccheaus' rookie season? Was it 2018 or 2019? Either way. But, like Harris is a sort of undersized 5'9", 183-pound slot type, but played at a low level competition, but went to the NFLPA Bowl and had a good week of practice there. Then after Harris, you probably have Mike Jones Jr., who from LSU, the linebacker, he was LB 70 for Dane Brugler, undersized linebacker, about 6 foot 227, a former Clemson player, was the backup to Isaiah Simmons a couple of years ago, and then eventually didn't get on the field and transferred to LSU. So he's an interesting guy to keep an eye on. 2 other receivers in Xavier Malone out of Henderson State, another undersized guy, 5'7", 180 pounds, but he ran a 4.35. So he's got some serious juice. And then Justin Marshall, Buffalo receiver, 6'2", 205, ran a 4.48, kind of a big contested catch guy. He went to Louisville and then transferred to Buffalo this past year. And then the last undrafted free agent is running back Carlos Washington Jr., Southeastern Louisiana. He was RB 124 to Dane Brugler. Xavier Malone was wide receiver 97. Justin Marshall was wide receiver 58. And Mike Jones was linebacker 70, if I didn't mention that earlier. So of these guys, I would probably say Keelan Harris has the best shot of making the roster just because there's so much turmoil at the wide receiver position, but he would have to leapfrog Frank Darby and Jared Bernhardt. It's not impossible, but I think all of these guys are decent candidates to make the practice squad, right? Like typically, the practice squad, you get a select group of UDFAs that, show out in camp that the team wants to sort of, develop into the future. And then there's, a select group of players that are, returning players that, or whatever. So I think all of these guys have a decent shot of making the practice squad, but Keelan Harris is probably the most intriguing of this group to me. We'll see if I get a chance to watch more of these guys as the summer unfolds, and maybe another guy will emerge. But let's wrap up today's episode talking about the 5th-year option that the Falcons gave to AJ Terrell, fully guaranteed $12.3 million for the 2024 season, which will be his final year of his contract. And we've talked before about how AJ Terrell is likely to get a contract extension before that 5th-year option hits next season, that at some point next offseason, we would expect the Falcons to try to negotiate a long-term deal with AJ Terrell. We talked with Josh Kendall of The Athletic earlier this offseason, and Josh mentioned that he did, I asked him, is AJ Terrell the next in line after Chris Lindstrom got his big deal? And Josh was like, I don't know if the Falcons are quite there yet with AJ Terrell. And I think some people interpreted it as like the Falcons are out on AJ Terrell. I don't think, I've talked to Josh since then. That wasn't the way that he wanted to portray. It was just like, we just aren't there yet in terms of the Falcons forking up the money, because the money that they would have to fork up to get AJ Terrell on a deal is probably pretty high, especially if he has another good season. Just because, like, you look at the recent deals that have been signed in the last couple of off seasons for the cornerback, you're talking about easily $18 million a year for AJ Terrell, if not 20, 22 or more $1 million a year. The highest paid cornerback in the NFL is Jair Alexander of the Green Bay Packers. He just signed a $21 million a year deal last May. You also had, was it Xavier Howard, I think, signed for $18 million last April, and Denzel Ward signed for $20 million last April as well. So, like, those are the recent deals. So if you're David Mulligetta, AJ Terrell's agent, you're looking to push, to see if you can get your guy to be the new highest paid corner. And that's realistic, I think, if AJ Terrell has that type of season. So we'll see if the Falcons get there with AJ Terrell, but he will definitely be under contract through the 2024 season. That will not be the case for Jeff Okudah. The Falcons did not pick up his option, but they technically could not pick up his option because we learned that due to the Lions agreeing to restructure and take on about $1.5 million of his salary this year, that he was not eligible for a 5th-year option. But even if he was eligible, as we discussed on the heels of that trade, it was very unlikely that the Falcons were going to pick it up. So Okudah is basically on a 1-year prove-it deal. If he plays well, he'll get a new deal from the Falcons. I'm thinking somewhere in that Jamel Dean range. If he has an especially good year, which is about $14 million a year, somewhere probably south of that number is probably the more likelier bet. But if he does not play well, if Jeff Okudah does not play well, then it's likely the Falcons will be back in the cornerback market next offseason. We'll see how that goes for them in free agency and or the draft. So what I will say to wrap up today's episode is we'll probably see more roster moves over the next couple of weeks as we get into rookie mini camp. This was around the time last year that the Falcons made the trade for Brian Edwards. Again, we're shooting for Corey Davis, and also signed Nick Kwiatkowski in mid-May around those rookie mini camps. So, I think we'll see some tryout players get picked up. We'll see some players, that are some of these back-end roster guys, especially some of these guys that we re-signed to futures deal back in January. They may get cut, as well as the Falcons bring in, new blood here into the building. So there's probably going to be some roster churning over the next couple of days and weeks, and we'll keep an eye on that and give you updates to anything that's notable. But of course, we still have lots of post-draft content coming your way. Again, Will McFadden should be on the podcast tomorrow to talk about his thoughts on the Falcons draft class, and we'll have some more guests on in the coming days. We'll have to get Jarvis's back on the podcast very soon. I'm giving him some space because I know he's still coming down from his anger over the Falcons, not taking a pass rusher at the top, and I'm afraid Jarvis might do me some bodily harm if we get face to face on camera together. This is the whole Bijan Robinson thing, but we'll see how that goes. Jarvis will be back on the podcast very soon, guys. But in the meantime, continue to subscribe to Locked On Falcons on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Continue to make us your first listen. And if you want to get more insight into what's going on in the rest of the league, make sure you check out the Locked On NFL podcast. They're still going strong post-draft, all the big talking points from around the NFL as we, are so focused on the Atlanta Falcons. What's going on with the other 31 teams? Check out Locked On NFL. It's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.